Hi, I'm Anna C. Mallon, and I'm with the AWS startup team, talking to you today about finding the right team members and understanding founder chemistry in a little bit more depth. So just moving myself a little bit out of the way here, I'll be speaking to someone who has looked at founder chemistry and will help us define that. What high-performing unicorn startup teams look like and what they have in common. What to actually look for when you're looking for a co-founder or hiring team members. We will be exploring and defining what blind spots are, both individual blind spots as well as team blind spots, and why these are so important to consider when actually looking for the right team members. We will explore what mindsets are correlated with being successful at raising capital, and also be hearing about common mistakes and pitfalls around the hiring process. I'm Anna C. Mallon, and over the past 20 years, I've led 15 global accelerators or venture capital-backed programs. I've worked with close to 2,000 startup entrepreneurs and corporate intrapreneurs across Southeast Asia, Europe, Australia. I've started multiple companies and so had to find, develop, and lead the right people, something which I found particularly challenging, which is why I have sought out different ecosystem players to help analyze this specific challenge that we face in a startup, which is, of course, an environment of extreme uncertainty. And that's why it's my absolute pleasure to talk today with Michelle Duval, who is the founder and CEO of Fingerprint for Success. She will tell us all about what Fingerprint for Success does, the research it is building on, and she's also the co-author of 2 international books on coaching. She's worked with individuals and remarkable organizations across Australia, USA, South Africa, Sweden, the Netherlands, the UK, and of course across Asia. She has personally coached multiple unicorn companies and worked with accelerators and their cohorts around the world, identifying and building high-performing teams. Please bear in mind that these are the experiences and thoughts and learnings that we have gathered from our own personal experience over the years, and that they do not reflect the opinions of AWS. Brilliant. Well, Michelle, so nice to see you again. Thank you so much for making the time, calling in from Sydney. We're literally on the other sides of the planet right now. Tell me a little bit about yourself and, how do you work with startups?
Well, Anna, it's really exciting to talk with you. Thank you for the opportunity to share Fingerprint for Success and, importantly, our research for startups. So I'm the founder and the CEO of Fingerprint for Success. We are a people analytics and artificial intelligence coaching company. And we have done some world-first research looking at the attitudes and the motivations. So you might call mindset, and the correlations between that and early stage and later stage startup success.
The startups that are listening to us here on the platform, that predominantly early stage and potentially even in the stages of looking for a co-founder or, the right people for their startup. So from what you've seen, around predicting success and sort of high performing teams, what should they look for when looking, for example, for a co-founder?
Well, one of the first things to look for in a co-founder is actually to do with values. A little bit about my background. I spent the last 25 years actually as the personal coach to over 5 different unicorn startups. So that's, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that language, it's a startup that's reached more than $1 billion euro or dollar valuation. And I've worked with over 25 startups that have achieved more than 100, 200, 300, 400, $500 million valuation, plus many startups that have actually failed. It was actually these experiences that led me to have a hypothesis that there was a strong correlation between specific mindsets and venture outcomes. And so when we think about those early stages where you're forming, values become super important, because the things that you value as co-founders will determine how much alignment you've got. It will also help you to have the longevity in the relationship. And the third part is it's going to be the source of where you have conflict. So if you don't have alignment in values, that will usually be the source of where those co-founder partnerships come undone. You cannot undervalue the importance of chemistry in that co-founder partnership. So that's the first part as a tip, is make sure you've got enough touch points that you're going to be able to stay connected through the natural challenges of a partnership. The second key is to be able to have what we call and what we measure in our data is a very high bias for proactive action. That is the speed at which you can turn your ideas into action. They are correlated with more rounds of venture capital, correlated with higher exits, correlated with larger scale. And it is pretty much, we measure how much hustle have you got. So we know it's an American term, but hustle is obviously the speed at which you can turn your ideas into action. Is basically the opposite of how long do you wait. Yeah. The third tip is around what we refer to as low structure and low procedures. One of the most interesting findings from the research that we've done in our data sets is that successful early stage ventures, particularly deep tech or any tech startup, is we found a very low bias or a very low preference for advanced planning and advanced structuring. We actually found that high structure and planning was correlated with early stage venture failure. And so, you know, high structure is about in-depth planning before you've done any experimentation or validation. And so the tip is to ensure that you don't get locked in that high structure, because if you are a technically orientated founding team, you will naturally have a high bias towards structure. And while that's important from the tech functional side, in terms of the entrepreneurial leadership required for founders to scale the venture and to get through all those gates, it means being able to move rapidly, move quickly, validating things before investing in the planning and the structure and the resourcing of them.
Brilliant. And, you know, obviously I'm a little bit biased because I know your research. You know, I've obviously been exposed to Fingerprint for Success, and conceptually, you know, I think it makes a lot of sense, but very practically, you know, for startups that are not so familiar with obviously the research, what does it mean when they are in a situation of needing to hire? How do I go about assessing whether our values are in sync? How do I go about checking whether the people have high initiation, which is, I believe, the term used in the Fingerprint for Success? And the last one, of course, how can I make sure that I get people on board who will not sort of obsess about structure in the early days?
Yeah, well, you're definitely going to end up, if you've got a very technically orientated company, the functional technical people are going to need to have that structure, and they're going to really find it hard to move as quickly as you need to. I've had the honor and the privilege of coaching some of the most technically advanced startups in the world. And one of the cool things is that, you know, these are the coolest people in the world, which is really great. And what they've learned through those experiences, through the coaching, is that they want to attract the world's best talent. And that's obviously having a really great narrative, a really great story, and enrolling people deeply in your mission. When people understand why you are building the technologies that you are building, and you capture their heart, you capture their spirit, they want to be a part of whatever that's going to be. So as a founder, being able to use your voice, to be able to tell the stories, to be able to share the narrative is going to be the very reason that people join your startup. It will be the reason that you achieve the rounds of venture that you need to be able to get through those journeys. So that's going to help to obviously get the talent. The second part is that you want to be able to know, as these team members come in, they're going to bring skills as an important asset. But what we know, and this is a key about the future of work, is that the skills required in a startup constantly change. You'll bring a team member into a specific role, but that role could change within 3 months. And suddenly now you've got this team member who you hired for a functional role that needs to move on to another team, another functional role. That's why we always say hire on attitude and motivation. Because when you hire on that, it's the most transferable asset in your startup. If you have team members who are comfortable to figure things out as they go, they don't need the plan. If they have big picture thinking, we found that correlated with greater ambition, more rounds of capital. It means they don't need to go in a lot of detail to understand things quickly. And I've already mentioned the initiation, for example. But the cool thing about that data is that that's actually visible. You don't actually, once you understand the data, you actually don't need to use even the assessment, because you can visually see it. You can identify in interviews. You can figure out that, otherwise intangible asset of that hustle. So that's why we always distinguish, and it's a really important distinguishing factor. The founder entrepreneurial leadership versus the functional team members. And if we don't understand that, you might be the most technical founder, but if you don't have the entrepreneurial mindset, your startup will fail.
Wow, that's really insightful and interesting. And it makes a lot of sense when we're thinking about sort of the interviewing or the selection process. Yeah. But taking maybe a step, back here on the recruitment, how does education, for example, level of education, for instance, play a part? If I put something in a job ad, how much emphasis should I put on there? Given that you've just said, hire for motivations and attitudes, how does that then affect how we recruit or how we actually try and build a pipeline of candidates?
Yeah. Well, obviously, skills and experience is going to be important at some functional level. If you need a graphic designer, or you need a UX UI designer, or you need, someone who's going to, manage your infrastructure and your AWS, you are going to be hiring specifically for some functional talent. The skills will be important. But when you get those candidates into the pipeline, you're actually looking for the X factor. And the X factor, when all things are equal, is going to be the attitude and motivation. And so, because as we've already said, let's just say you are hiring someone for infrastructure, that role could radically change in a very short period of time if the startup gets the traction that it gets. Most of the startups that I work with are spinning up new teams every 3 to 6 months, which means people are rotating every 3 to 6 months. And so you're going to be hiring people that start somewhere and are going to rapidly move somewhere else in the organization as it becomes an organization. So that is where you are asking questions very early on in the process. You're working with recruiters or talent acquisition teams that are able to, do a lot of screening already around those attitudes and motivations very early on. And then we would recommend that you use Fingerprint for Success as one of the data points in your process for being able to identify along skills, experience, attitude, and motivation.
Got it. I mean, you've worked and coached with so many impressive companies. You've just mentioned, the unicorns. I mean, the research is based on the identification of patterns. So if you were to describe what it is that the most successful founder teams in terms of chemistry have, what would it be? And what, should we try to aspire for when we try and match up?
Yeah, one of the ones that we think is a real, we think of these as lubricants. Lubricants mean it makes the relationship easy, it makes it fluid, it makes it flow. And when you're creating stuff that's revolutionary in the world, you need to have somewhere where you can have that level of connection. You can't just only have friction. So some of those ingredients include what we call a bias towards goals. So we know in a technical environment that most folk have a natural bias towards problems. They get excited about challenges, excited about problems. And this is really awesome from a technical standpoint. But when it comes to leadership, what we found is that a focus on goal orientation gives people a direction, it gives them meaning, it gives them purpose. And when you've got that alignment as the leadership group, the co-founder chemistry, you're able to talk about solutions, not get lost only in the problems. So a focus towards goals allows you to look for solutions together rather than only talking with each other about the issues and problems that you have in the startup or between you. That's tip number one. Tip number two is what we call a bias for tolerance. Tolerance is a motivation that says, you've got your rules and standards and your style and your way of working. I've got mine. The two can coexist. Because here's the thing, when you're in a startup, you don't have the ideal of anything. You never feel like you've got enough money. You never feel like you've got enough team members, and you most certainly don't feel like you've got the best computers and the best setup, unless you are fortunate to raise an enormous amount of money from day one. But even still, you still feel like you've never got enough. And so when someone has a bias for tolerance, you're accepting of other people, you're accepting of the resources you've got, and you do the best within the limitations that you've got. So you're not complaining, you're not getting unnecessarily reactive to the other person. You're really appreciating the differences that the team member brings. Some really cool research is about diverse teams, those teams that have the most cognitive diversity. And the findings show that cognitively diverse teams are better at problem solving. They make better decisions, and they're way more innovative. But here's the thing, they feel way more uncomfortable than a homogeneous team. A homogeneous team is going to make decisions that all feel really good. They're probably going to make the decisions really easily, but they're going to come out with a sense of, blind to the fact that they've not challenged the decisions. They won't know for certain that they've made the right decision. Whereas a diverse team might feel a bit more uncomfortable, but that's actually the point. The discomfort causes better decision making. And so this is what tolerance does. Tolerance says, I embrace the differences in my team. I want different viewpoints. I want a cognitively diverse team, which means gender, race, sexuality, all these different distinctions. So a high focus on tolerance makes a really diverse team.
I love that. And it's really good that you mentioned that it's not an easy path, but it's definitely one to a greater innovative success. I just want to come back to the word blind spots, which is something you mentioned earlier. And I also learned from Fingerprint for Success is something that you help to identify either personal blind spots or team blind spots. Could you give examples of what a blind spot could be for a team?
Yeah. The metaphor that we use is, when you're driving on the freeway and you are wanting to overtake the vehicle in front of you, we look in our rear view mirror, the one to wherever we're driving, whatever side of the road we're on, we look in that on the side and we look in the rear view mirror. And between the two, we have actually an optical blind spot where we are forced to have to turn our head to be able to see. And if we don't remember we've got the blind spot, we can, go to overtake and crash into the car next to us. And so when we have motivations, we can sometimes have such strong biases that we don't even realize what we're missing out, what we can't see until we crash into it. And a great example of that is that if I have a very strong bias for reflecting and waiting, it means that I'm going to naturally be strategic. I'm going to have stamina and perseverance to follow through, and I'm going to be comfortable waiting organically for action to happen. And I won't know and realize that my inaction is actually going to cause my startup failure, because our research found that high initiation, the speed at which you turn your ideas into action, is directly correlated with the more rounds of capital, the speed at which you grow your startup, etc. Now, if I've got such a strong bias that reflection and patience is important to be strategic, to make the right decisions, and I don't know that my initiation is so low in my startup that I'm going to fail, I will only go at the speed and pace, and I'm going to crash and burn. So a blind spot is where you are ignorant or unaware that you have a missing spot, and you go about your day and you go about your work operating from the previous context you've been in where you probably were successful. So knowing and having that self-awareness eliminates the blind spot, because then you can decide, what am I going to do with this blind spot? Am I going to hire someone else into the team, or do I actually already have a co-founder who covers my blind spot? And that's the cool thing about a diverse team, because you've got a diverse team, you've got more perspectives, you're more likely to have a team member who actually has the missing piece for your team to be commercially successful. But the thing is, you probably don't know who that team member is and which biases you're not covering. And so that's the whole intent of why we created our technology, was we want more startups to be successful. We want them to be more successful faster. We want more people to be able to have access to capital, resources, and so on. And we want to change that statistic. We want to see, rather than, 2 to 10% of startups being successful, we want to flip it on its head. We want to see 90% of startups to be successful. A lot of research shows that 40 to 60% of business failure is actually due to leadership, management, and team dynamics. It doesn't have to be that way.
Should I proactively look to hire to fill or complement my blind spots? That's question one. And I guess a follow-up question would be, if I do have blind spots as a team, is there something that I can do about it?
Yeah. In terms of hiring for blind spots, I would first look internally to the co-founders to learn about your dynamics and to see who in the team has the asset that you're looking for. So one of the most significant findings we found from the research was that successful founders have a very strong commercial bias. So they have a bias towards the monetization of whatever it is that they're doing. We found that those who start and exit within 5 to 7 years have a particularly high bias for this. And so if you and your whole team have a low focus unconsciously on the commercial side of the venture, this is going to be a team-wide blind spot. In that case, we want to definitely hire in to cover that blind spot. We also want to make sure that we have advisors and board members that cover that blind spot. We also want to make sure that we've got mentors that cover that blind spot. And if you're wanting to have long-term success, I would recommend that you develop that blind spot. So that you overcome that, if it's something as serious as that kind of a blind spot. Mm-hmm. If you've actually got 2 other co-founders who have a high bias on money and you don't, use them as an asset. Defer to them in that context. Listen to them in that context. Because that's the whole thing about a blind spot, is if you don't realize that you've got the low focus on money, you're going to be fighting head to head with them and not realize that there's nothing to fight about. Their commercial bias is what you need to follow. So if you know your blind spots, you can better optimize your team, you waste less time, you accelerate your startup faster. And definitely if you have a team-wide blind spot, you definitely want to surround yourself with advisors, board and mentors, and hiring.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. It's really such interesting and useful information for startups, because hiring is obviously one of the biggest challenges that makes up the DNA of the company as they grow. What are, maybe to round it up, some of the biggest mistakes and pitfalls that you have seen in this context?
Yeah. So the biggest mistake is to not realize that we all have blind spots, and to have an ego that says that you need to be perfect and that you need to be right. The most successful founders are, I would say, ferociously hungry to learn about the mechanisms in their startup and to learn about themselves, and they never stop learning. I've been humbled again and again by founders who've become unicorns, and they continue to seek out coaching and other tools to grow and to become better. So number one, don't be ignorant, don't lack self-awareness. That's something that you can control. And so don't be that person who blindly said you were too busy to learn about yourself. The second one is, in terms of pitfalls, is the failure to listen and to embrace the changes on the journey. So our research found that the attitudes and motivations for a startup, some of those that helped to facilitate success early on, actually need to change post Series A or B in venture capital. So as you start to scale, get larger, some of those motivations that you needed earlier must change to be successful. And again, the failure to recognize that in yourself will mean that you enter that valley of death of why some startups fail to scale up. So this is where, surrounding yourself with board members, advisors, and mentors, and other founders who've got through that journey, and really seeking out to go and learn from other startups is super important. But also to get the insights about yourself around how your leadership as a founder needs to change through that period.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and for all of the work that you do, the very important work around helping founders grow into tremendous businesses that really impact the whole society and globe. It's really a true honor to know you and to work with you and to have again the opportunity here to showcase some of the work that you do.
And thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you. It's an absolute delight and pleasure to speak with you personally. You have been working so closely for all of your career with startups, and so you bringing this information and all that you're curating for all the startups that you're supporting is such a contribution. And we at Fingerprint for Success are heavy users of AWS services. We are very impressed with AWS as an organization and the support that we've received from AWS. Thanks so much, Anna.
So it's Anna here again. At the end, I thought we could do a little wrap up. I hope that you have found this conversation with Michelle useful. The takeaways that Michelle has shared with us from the research and the experience she has gathered includes that obviously timing, market, value proposition, the amount of capital, access, connections, but also the human factor around founders matter for the success of a startup. The alignment on values and touch points with co-founders is important for longevity in the relationship. Looking for team members who show a high bias for proactive action, so the speed to turn ideas into action is recommended. The research and experience Michelle has shared suggests not to get locked into high structure in the early stages and to look for team members who can do that. Because the job roles in a startup change so quickly and so often, it could be 3 to 6 months rotational, it is important to recruit for motivations and attitudes. Developing a great narrative, an inspiring story, and engaging people deeply in your mission, why you are building this startup and the technology, is going to help you along that journey. Focusing towards goals and not only problems has shown to also bring great success when it comes to building and assembling the right team. A bias for tolerance, diverse teams are better at problem solving and they are more innovative. Building and being in a diverse team might feel more uncomfortable, but this discomfort, as Michelle has shared, causes better decision making. It is critical to know your blind spots, both our individual blind spots as well as our team blind spots, and to optimize your team, waste less time, and ultimately accelerate your startup faster. If you should have blind spots that cover your entire team, Michelle suggests to work with advisors, board members, mentors, or to look at hiring to mitigate and fill those gaps. What Michelle has seen to be absolutely critical is to be ferociously hungry to learn, to be self-critical and to be self-aware. And also an interesting insight is to be ready to change your motivations and attitudes once you have passed the Series A investment stage. Once again, I hope that you have found this conversation useful, and we look forward to helping your growth and journey with AWS.